Rain had turned the low end of Halvard Bissett's pig yard into a shallow red lake. He stood at the gate at first light, 71 years old, boots sunk to the ankle, watching a sow named Greta pick her way across a sludge that clung to her legs like wet paint. The drainage ditch he'd dug 40 years back had vanished under it. He said nothing. He never said much. He gripped the top rail, felt the old ache travel up his wrist, and told himself the same thing he told himself every morning now. Hold the line. Ask no one. Outlast it. The red water crept another inch toward the sheds. His granddaughter Wren came out with 2 mugs of coffee, 19, and already smarter than he'd been at 40. She handed him one and looked at the mess. "You can't fix this alone, Grandpa." "Fixed everything else alone." "That's not a virtue," she said. "That's just what happened to you." He drank. The coffee was too weak. She always made it weak. He didn't complain, because complaining was another way of asking, and asking was a door he'd nailed shut a long time ago, after Marta died and the neighbors brought casseroles he couldn't eat and pity he couldn't stomach. "The ceramics plant did this," Wren went on. "You should be talking to people. The other farms downstream. The county. Somebody." "Somebody," he repeated, like the word tasted off. "You act like needing help is the same as losing." She sipped. "It isn't." He grunted and walked toward the sheds. The Bissett farm sat in a shallow valley in the northern part of the county, 41 acres of it, most given to a herd of 38 pigs that Halvard had built up from 4 over the course of his adult life. He knew each of them by temperament, if not by name. He knew which sow would crush a piglet if you weren't watching, and which boar would take your fingers off if you reached in wrong. That knowledge lived in his hands. It was the one inheritance he trusted. He'd been born in the farmhouse that still stood at the top of the rise, a squat structure of fieldstone and timber his own grandfather had raised. The pig sheds below it were younger but not young, pole barns of weathered pine, their posts sunk in the earth, their roofs patched with whatever had been cheap in whatever year they'd failed. 3 sheds, a feed store, a low boundary wall of stacked stone that marked the property line against the Ostergaards to the east. Everything on the place had been built by a Bissett hand, and everything on the place was tired. Money was the quiet problem underneath all the loud ones. Pork prices had slid 2 years running. Halvard kept a ledger in a drawer, entries in pencil, and the pencil told a story he didn't like to read twice. Feed costs up, a vet bill from the spring farrowing still half unpaid, the property tax due in autumn, and no clear way to meet it without selling breeding stock he couldn't afford to lose. He was land-rich in the way that means poor. He owned everything and could spend nothing. Wren had come to live with him after her mother, his daughter Lise, took a nursing contract 3 states over. It was meant to be a summer. The summer had stretched. Wren was supposed to start at the agricultural college in the city come autumn. She had the acceptance letter pinned to the fridge and a deposit already paid. $400 Halvard had insisted on covering because it was the one bill on the place that pointed forward instead of back. She worked the farm beside him in the meantime, and she was good at it, and neither of them said aloud that her leaving would gut the operation. He could not run 38 pigs alone. They both knew it. They both left it alone. The trouble beside them was the Kalan Ceramics Works, a mid-sized tile and sanitary ware plant that had opened 3 years earlier on the parcel that bordered the Bissett land to the north, up the slope. Tile-making left behind a heavy waste, a fine red clay slurry, the residue of shaping and washing and the settling ponds, thick as pudding when it dried. The plant piped its overflow into a permitted retention basin, but the basin had been cut too small for the volume, and in wet weather it topped its earthen lip, and the red slurry ran downhill along the natural drainage, which meant it ran onto the lowest, wettest corner of Halvard's land, where his ditches fed a culvert under the county road. The first year it had been a nuisance, the second a problem. This spring, with heavy rains, it had become a siege. The slurry filled his ditches faster than he could clear them. Standing water backed up into the near shed, and the red clay, drying, set hard around the base of his oldest pole barn, holding moisture against the pine like a poultice, softening the posts at ground level where rot does its work. Halvard knew rot. He'd fought it his whole life with creosote and stubbornness. He knew that a post soft at the collar would fail in a hard wind, and he knew the near shed housed his farrowing sows, and he knew that if that shed came down in the wrong week, he'd lose a litter and maybe a sow, and the ledger would tip from bad to finished. He knew all of this. What he did not know, that gray morning, boots red to the ankle, was that the thing drowning his farm was the same thing that would save it, and that he'd have to learn how to ask for help before he could learn how to use it. 10 days after the rains, the near shed's northeast post let go. It didn't crash. It was quieter and worse than that. Halvard was inside at dusk, checking Greta, who was heavy with a litter due any day, when he heard the roof timber give a long groan, like a man settling into a chair. He looked up. The purlin along the north wall had dropped 2 inches at its end, and the post beneath it, the corner post, sunk in ground now permanently wet with clay, had canted outward, its base swallowed in a hard red collar of dried sludge. The whole northeast corner of the shed was leaning into the muck by a hand's width that had not been there a week ago. He put his shoulder under the low corner out of pure instinct, as if a 71-year-old body could hold up a barn. Greta grunted and shifted in her pen, sensing the wrongness. If the corner failed with her in it, in labor, he'd lose everything in that pen at once. He got her out. He moved her to the middle shed in the dark and the drizzle, coaxing 300 pounds of pregnant sow across a yard of red muck by lantern light. And by the time she was penned safe, his back was a sheet of fire, and his hands were shaking, and the near shed stood empty and crooked against the last of the light. He stood in the yard, breathing hard, and understood that he could not out-stubborn this. The sludge had come for the buildings now. He did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and the pencil and the weak coffee gone cold, and he tried to think his way to the edge of the problem. The obvious answer was to make the plant stop. Kellen Ceramics had done this. Kellen Ceramics should fix it. Wren was right about that much. But Halvard had been to the county once before, years back, over a boundary dispute with the Ostergaards, and he remembered how it went. Forms, waiting, a hearing scheduled for a season away, a clerk who spoke to him like he was slow. The plant employed 60 people in a county that had few enough jobs. He had no illusions about whose side the paperwork would take, and even if he won, even if some inspector agreed the basin was undersized, the plant would spend a year appealing and building a new pond, and in that year his near shed would be a pile of red-caked pine, and his farrowing sows would be dead or sold. "So we go anyway," Wren said in the morning, when he laid it out. "We file. We get the downstream farms to file too. The Ostergaards get the runoff same as us. There's strength in—" "The Ostergaards," he said, "haven't spoken a civil word to a Bissett since my father's time." Which was true, and which was also, he knew even as he said it, an excuse. The real objection was underneath, that filing meant standing in a county office and saying, in front of clerks and neighbors, "I cannot manage my own land." It meant the casserole faces again. It meant being the old man who couldn't cope. He did not say that part. Wren heard it anyway. "You'd rather the shed fall down than knock on a door," she said. "I'd rather solve my own trouble on my own ground." The second option was to clear the sludge himself and shore the post. He tried it that afternoon. He hired nothing. Hiring cost money he didn't have, so he took a spade and a mattock to the red collar around the failed post, and he learned his first real lesson about the material that was ruining him. It did not shovel like mud. Where it was heavy as wet cement and clung to the spade in slabs that had to be scraped off by hand. Where it had dried, it had set nearly to stone, gripping the post base in a shell he had to chip at with the mattock, and every strike jarred up his arms into his bad wrist. He worked 3 hours and cleared a patch the size of a tabletop and had to stop because his hands wouldn't close. He looked at what he'd done and what remained and did the arithmetic of an old body against a problem that size, and the arithmetic was bleak. But something had caught his attention in those 3 hours. When he'd chipped a slab of the dried sludge free and knocked it against a stone, it hadn't crumbled like dried mud. It had rung, almost, and broken clean, like a poorly fired brick. He turned a piece over in his raw hands. It had set that hard, just lying in the weather, unshaped, unfired, mixed with nothing but whatever grit and straw and manure had washed into it from his own yard. It had a shape it wanted to take. He set the piece on the windowsill in the kitchen and didn't say why. That evening he weighed the two costs against each other one last time. Do nothing, and the near shed falls, the farrowing fails, the ledger tips, the tax goes unpaid, and he loses the land his grandfather cleared, the one outcome he had organized his whole stubborn life to prevent. Act through the county, and wait a year he did not have, while begging help he could not stomach asking for. Both roads ended with him losing the farm. One slow, one slower. Wren found him at the window with the piece of dried sludge in his hand. "What is that?" "The plant's poison," he said, "set up hard as a fired brick, all on its own, out in the rain." She looked at it. She looked at him. He watched her arrive at the thought a half-second before he'd have let himself say it. "Grandpa, bricks cost money to buy." "They do," he said. "You need to rebuild the shed anyway." "I do." Neither of them said the whole thing, but the piece of red stone sat between them on the sill, like a question that had finally found its answer. He didn't announce a decision. Announcing was another kind of asking. He simply got up before light the next morning, took a feed bucket and the spade, and went down to the red corner of his own land to gather the thing that was trying to destroy him. He filled 4 buckets with the wet slurry from the ditch and hauled them, 2 at a time, to the concrete apron outside the feed store where he had light and a flat surface. His wrist screamed. He ignored it. He was committing to a thing he did not understand, with a body that was failing and no money to buy his way out of a single mistake, and he knew all of that, and he did it anyway, because the alternative was to stand at the county counter with his hat in his hands. That was the flaw still driving him. He'd chosen the harder road, not because it was wiser, but because it let him stay alone. He told himself it was independence. It was fear, wearing independence's coat. Wren came out and found the buckets, the spade. The old man crouched over red slop with his sleeves pushed up, and she didn't say, "I told you so." She got a second bucket. "If we're doing this," she said, "we're doing it right, which means writing things down." He almost told her he'd managed 60 years without writing things down. He handed her the pencil instead. Wren became the story's second engine and its conscience. She wasn't just muscle he'd been handed by circumstance. She had the college acceptance on the fridge and a mind built for exactly the thing he'd stumbled into. She'd taken chemistry. She knew words like binder and aggregate and cure that he only knew as feel. But she wanted something he didn't. She wanted him to build this out loud, to bring people in, to make the thing bigger than one stubborn man and his failing wrists. Every ledger line she kept was an argument, proof that a shared problem could become a shared answer. "You keep records so nobody can call you a liar," she said, ruling a page into columns. "And so somebody else can do it after you. That's the whole point. A thing only one person can do dies with that person." Cheerful. "I'm going to college in 8 weeks, Grandpa," she said it lightly, but it landed heavy on the table between them. "Whatever this is, it has to work without me, so I'm writing it down." He looked at the empty columns and understood the deadline had a name now. The first batch taught him everything by failing. He reasoned, that first week, like a man who'd patched barns his whole life, if the sludge set hard on its own, he'd just pack it into a form and let it dry, and he'd have a brick. He built a mold from 4 scraps of 1x4, nailed into an open rectangle, the size of a proper building block, and he shoveled the wet red slurry in, tamped it down with a length of 2x2, struck off the top, and lifted the frame away. The block slumped at once, bulging at the sides, then held its rough shape. He set 9 of them on planks in the sun outside the feed store and felt, for the first time in weeks, something close to hope. 3 days later, he had 9 failures. They'd dried, and they were hard as the slab he'd chipped off the post, but every one of them had cracked clean through as it cured. Some in 2 pieces, some in 4, wide fissures running corner to corner like a dry lake bed. He picked one up, and it came apart in his hands along the crack, the 2 halves grinding faintly. Wren was crouched over them with her notebook. "They shrank," she said. "Look at the mold line. They pulled in from the edges. The outside dried before the inside, and the middle tore itself apart. So they dry slower." "Maybe. But I think it's more than that." She pressed a thumbnail into a broken face. "It's almost pure clay. Pure clay's all fines, tiny flat particles. They pack tight, hold water, and when the water leaves they slump against each other and crack. My chem teacher had us do this with pond silt. You have to give it something with a spine, something coarse mixed through so the fine stuff has a frame to grip." She was describing, in the language of a classroom, the thing brickmakers had known for 4,000 years, and that Halvard half knew from a different direction entirely. Because when she said, "give it a spine," he thought of a wall his father had shown him once, a section of old cob in a derelict cottage down the valley. Earth and straw, packed by hand, still standing after a century. Straw. His father had said, the straw held it together like the bones hold the meat. "Straw," he said. "Fiber," she agreed, writing. "Reinforcement. What else do we have? A mountain of that's coarse." They had, between the 2 of them, an inventory of a working pig farm, and they laid it out like a hand of cards. Chopped straw, from the bales he bought for bedding, cheap, on hand, already dry, dried pig manure, which he'd forked and stacked and let rot into a dark, crumbly compost for years, meaning to spread it and never getting to it. It was fibrous and light and full of half-broken straw already. And furnace ash, a whole bin of it. The gray grit raked out from the wood and coal stove that heated the farmhouse through the long winters, saved out of the same thrift that saved everything on the place. Halvard stood looking at the 3 heaps, red clay, dark manure, gray ash, and the pile of cracked bricks, and he felt the shape of an idea he couldn't yet name. The clay was the glue. It set too hard and too fast and tore itself apart doing it. The straw and the fibrous manure would be the spine Wren wanted, the frame the fine clay could grip so it didn't slump. And the ash is the grit, he said slowly. Sharp, doesn't hold water, fills the space between without turning to soup. You don't know that. No, he admitted, but my father limed his cob and swore by wood ash in a floor, said it kept the damp from wicking. He turned a cracked half-brick in his hand. We'll find out by ruining more of these. Wren wrote a heading at the top of a fresh page, and under it a date, and under that the words that would organize the next month of both their lives. Batch 2, add spine and grit. Find the numbers. That was the whole trick, she'd tell him later. Not the idea, the numbers. Finding the numbers meant treating his feed store apron like a laboratory, and it meant failing on purpose, in small, controlled amounts, which went against every instinct in Halvard's body. He wanted to mix one good batch and build a wall. Wren made him mix 6 bad ones first. She set it up like the chemistry problems she'd done in school. Change one thing at a time, hold the rest steady, write down what you did so you could tell why it worked or didn't. They measured by the bucket and the shovelful because they had no scale that would take clay, and Wren converted everything into rough proportions in her notebook: 5 of clay, 1 of ash, a half of manure, a double handful of chopped straw, so that a good result could be repeated and a bad one understood. Batch 2, heavy on straw, dried without the big cracks but crumbled at the edges when he lifted it. Too much fiber, not enough clay to bind, like bread with no flour. Batch 3 cut the straw and upped the clay and cracked again, though less. Batch 4 brought in the ash at last, a full bucket of it to 5 of clay, and dried into something that held its corners and rang when he tapped it. But when Wren stood it on end and pressed her weight down through a board, it sheared along a seam of ash that hadn't mixed through. Not enough working, Halvard said. He knew this feel from a different craft entirely, from years of mixing feed mash, where a lazy stir left dry pockets that a pig would sort out and waste. You've got to work it till it's the same all the way through. No streaks. They started mixing longer, folding the heap over on itself with the spade the way he'd fold silage, wetting it a bucket at a time to a stiff paste that held a thumbprint without running. It was brutal work. His wrist gave out by mid-morning most days, and Wren took the spade, and there was a rough dignity in that handoff that neither of them named, the old man stepping back and the girl stepping in, the work continuing because there were 2 of them. Batch 5 was close. It cured hard, held its shape, took Wren's standing weight on a board without shearing. But when Halvard left one out through a night of rain and checked it at dawn, it had gone soft-skinned and slumped at one corner, the unfired clay drinking the water back in. That was the thing he'd feared most, because a brick that dissolved in rain was no brick at all. It was just the sludge again, wearing a brick's shape until the weather remembered what it really was. It has to shed water, he said, or it's nothing. A pig sheds a wet place. It'll stand in muck its whole life. This was the failure that taught the most, because solving it forced them past mixing and into curing, into time and heat and the slow chemistry of getting water out of clay for good. Wren, chewing her pencil, said the word that changed the project. Fired brick doesn't melt in rain. Ours does. The difference is heat. Real bricks get cooked till the clay changes. My teacher said the particles fuse. Past some temperature they don't turn back to mud. We can't build a kiln. But maybe we don't need a real kiln. Maybe we just need more heat and more dry than the sun gives us. Halvard looked across the yard at the near shed, crooked in its red collar, and past it to the middle shed, where Greta was due to Pharaoh any hour, and he thought about the one source of steady low heat on a winter farm, the thing he'd been feeding wood into his whole life. The stove, he said. The furnace. That's where the ash comes from in the first place. He almost smiled. We've been throwing away the heat and keeping the ash. Fool's arithmetic. Wren looked up. You want to dry bricks off the furnace? I want, he said carefully, to find out what a little heat and a lot of patience will do. Small test first. She wrote it down. The small test came the same night, and it came sooner than either of them planned, because Greta chose that night to Pharaoh. Halvard was in the middle shed past midnight, on his knees in the straw, doing the one thing his body still did without complaint, bringing pigs into the world. 10 piglets, and the 9th came wrong, back legs first and slow, and he worked it free with hands that knew the geometry of the thing better than his eyes did, and it lay still a moment on the straw, wet and blue, until he cleared its mouth and rubbed it hard with a sack, and it kicked and squealed. Wren, holding the lantern, let out a breath. 10, he said. 1 week. We'll keep the weak one warm by the stove. And there it was, handed to him by the night, a reason to have the furnace roaring and a runt piglet in a box beside it, and while he sat feeding the runt warm milk from a bottle at 2 in the morning, he set 3 small test bricks, thumb-sized wedges of his batch 5 mix, on the iron shelf at the side of the firebox, where the heat came off steady but not scorching. By dawn the runt was suckling, and the 3 wedges had baked to a deep brick red, lighter than before, ringing higher when he clinked them together. He dropped one in the water trough and left it while he did the morning feed. When he fished it out an hour later, it was whole, hard, unslumped. The water beaded and ran off its skin. He carried it dripping into the kitchen and set it on the table in front of Wren, who was asleep on her folded arms, and when she woke and saw it, she picked it up and turned it over and pressed her thumbnail against the wet face and left no mark. It held, she said. It held. But he made himself say the rest, because she'd taught him that. 3 little ones on a shelf overnight. That's not a wall. A wall's 1,000 bricks. I can't fit 1,000 bricks in the firebox, and I can't feed the furnace 1,000 nights. The scale problem was real, and it was his own doing, in a sense. His whole life had been about doing things one careful piece at a time. But a shed was not a piglet. A shed was volume, repetition, 100 bricks a day for weeks, and the furnace could bake maybe a dozen wedges a night. The arithmetic was, again, bleak. He felt the old despair reaching for him. It was Wren who reframed it, because reframing was her gift the way farrowing was his. You're thinking like there's one furnace, she said. But it's not the furnace, it's the principle. Heat and time drive the water out, and something in the clay changes so it won't come back. The furnace proved the principle on 3 bricks. Now we make the principle bigger and cheaper. She was drawing as she talked, a box in the notebook. A kiln's just a container that traps heat around the bricks and lets you burn fuel efficiently. Farmers built them for centuries out of nothing. A clamp kiln, you don't even need a building. You stack the raw bricks with fuel between them and cover the whole stack and let it burn slow from the inside. I don't have coal to spare. You have manure, she said, and you've been drying it for years. And straw, and scrap wood, and you've got a whole ruined shed's worth of old dry pine sitting crooked in the yard that has to come down anyway. She looked at him. The near shed's dead, Grandpa, but it can heat the bricks that build its replacement. Halvard sat with that. There was something in it that troubled the deep, thrifty core of him, and something that satisfied it, too. The ruined thing feeding the new thing, nothing wasted, the whole ugly disaster turning over on itself like a spade folding a heap. He'd spent weeks fighting the sludge as a thing done to him. She was teaching him to run it as a system. "Draw me the stack," he said. Building the first clamp kiln took 9 days and cost him more failures, and it was in those 9 days that the work stopped being a desperate patch and became, without anyone deciding it, a second trade. They chose a spot on high, dry ground behind the feed store because Wren pointed out that a kiln in a flood-prone corner was a fire that would drown. Halvard cleared and leveled it and laid a base of the cracked failed bricks from the early batches, his mistakes becoming the floor of the thing that would stop him making them. On that base they stacked the raw, sun-dried bricks in a careful lattice, leaving gaps and channels the way Wren's diagram showed, packing dried manure and chopped straw and split pine into the channels as fuel. The near shed came down over 3 of those days, Halvard taking it apart plank by plank rather than pushing it over, salvaging every nail into a coffee can, and the dry old pine went into the kiln as fuel, and the sound pine went aside for roof framing. He would not waste a board. He had never wasted a board. They sealed the stack under a skin of the wet clay slurry itself, the raw sludge, plastered over the whole clamp to hold the heat in, which pleased Halvard enormously, the poison sealing the cure. The first firing failed instructively. They lit it at the base at evening, and it caught and smoked and glowed, and Halvard sat up with it half the night the way he'd sit up with a sick sow, and toward morning one whole side slumped and collapsed inward with a soft roar and a gout of sparks. When it cooled, they dug out the wreck. The bricks near the fire channels were beautifully baked, hard and red and ringing, but they'd stacked too much fuel in the lower channels, and the fierce heat there had softened and bloated the bricks right against the fire until the stack lost its footing and fell. "Too hot, too fast, low down," Halvard said, sifting a warped brick between his hands. He understood this now in his body, the way he'd come to understand it. It was overfeeding. It was a fire like a greedy pig. Take too much at once and founder. Less fuel packed tighter and slower at the start. Warm it before you cook it. "Preheat," Wren said, writing. "Small fire first. Drive off the last damp, then build it up." The second firing, 3 days later, they lit low and kept low for a full day before letting it climb, and they spread the fuel more evenly through the channels, and Halvard sat up the whole night again, reading the color of the smoke and the glow through the clay skin, the way his father had taught him to read a coal fire. By the second dawn, the smoke had gone from white and steamy to thin and blue, which Wren said meant the water was long gone and the fuel was burning clean, and they let it die slow over another full day because she'd read that cooling too fast cracked the bricks as badly as drying too fast had. When they broke the cool clamp open on the 5th day, they had, out of a stack of roughly 240 raw bricks, about 190 sound ones, deep red, hard-fired, ringing when struck, shedding water, square enough to lay. Perhaps 30 were warped or cracked, and would go into the base of the next kiln. The rest were, by any fair measure, bricks, real ones, made from the flood. Halvard stood among them in the early light, and did something Wren had never seen him do. He sat down on the stack of them, right there in the yard, and put his red-dusted hands over his face for a moment, and when he took them away his eyes were wet, and he was almost laughing. "190, he said, "off the first good burn." "Off the second," she corrected, but she was grinning. "Off the second." He picked one up and looked at it like it was a newborn. "Write down the numbers." "All of them." "Exactly. So we can do it again." She already had. They built the new near shed that month, and it was the building of it that changed everything, because a building is public in a way that a pile of bricks is not. It went up on the old footprint, on new posts set in a bed of ash and gravel to keep the damp off. Halvard's own refinement, drawn from the same instinct that had guessed the ash, and its walls were the red bricks, laid in courses, mortared with a lean mix of the same clay. It was low and thick-walled and warm, warmer than the old pole barn had ever been, the mass of the brick holding the day's heat into the cold nights, so his farrowing sows lay easy. It was, plainly, better than what the sludge had destroyed. And it stood where anyone on the county road could see it. Ostergaard saw it first, the son, Piet, 40-odd, driving cattle feed past the fence line. He slowed his truck. He looked at the red-walled shed rising where the crooked pole barn had been, and he looked at the flood-scarred corner it was built from, and Halvard, up on the scaffold with a trowel, watched a man from a family that hadn't spoken to a Bissett in 50 years put 2 and 2 together. Piet leaned out the window. Bissett, what in hell are those made of? And Halvard, who had organized his whole life around not being asked and not asking, felt the question land like the first drop of a different kind of rain. He should have felt triumph. Instead, the questions started, and every one of them was a door he didn't know how to hold shut anymore. Piet Ostergaard came back the next day, on foot this time, to the fence line, and stood there with his cap in his hands in a way Halvard recognized, because it was the way he himself stood when he'd rather not be asking. The Ostergaards had the sludge too. The same runoff crossed their low field before it reached the road, and Piet had a machine shed with a rotting sill and no money to fix it, same as everyone in the valley since the pork price fell. "I'd pay for a load of them," Piet said. "The bricks, or I'd trade. I've got a good post drill you could use, and the loan of my boy for the heavy days." It was a fair offer, an easy offer, and it should have been simple, but it activated the exact flaw the whole story had been circling. Because to sell Piet a load of bricks meant admitting the method worked, meant it was no longer a private thing Halvard did to save his own farm, but a public claim he was making. "I have found something. I can make something worth buying," and the moment he made that claim, he opened himself to being wrong in front of everyone. What if Piet's wall failed? What if the bricks that held up fine in Halvard's dry-founded shed slumped in Piet's wet field? He'd be the old fool who sold his neighbor's poison dressed as brick. "They're not for sale," he heard himself say. "They're just for the farm." Piet's face closed. He put his cap back on. "Suit yourself, Bissett," and he walked back across his field, and Halvard stood at the fence, feeling the old solitude wrap around him like a familiar coat, and hating, for the first time, how well it fit. Wren had heard the whole thing from the shed door. "He offered you a post drill and free labor," she said. "We are drowning in work, and you have one good wrist. Why? Because if his wall falls down, it's my name on it. So you'd rather it never get built." She was angry now, in the quiet, clipped way she got. "That's the same thing you did with the county. Somebody offers to share the load, and you'd rather carry it alone until it kills you, because carrying it alone is the only thing that feels safe." She stopped herself, then didn't. "You know what's not in the notebook, Grandpa? How to do any of this without you. Because you won't let anybody else near it. You won't sell a brick, you won't teach a soul, and in 7 weeks I'm gone." 7 weeks. The deadline had teeth now. The pressure came from a second direction the same week, and this one had a letterhead. A notice arrived from Kellen Ceramics, not to Halvard directly, but posted at the county office and copied to the bordering parcels, announcing the plant's intent to formalize its drainage easement across the low ground of the neighboring properties. In plain terms, the plant wanted the legal right to keep running its overflow across Halvard's land and the Ostergaards permanently, and was moving to make it official before anyone thought to object. Wren read it twice. They're not stopping the sludge. They're getting permission to keep sending it, forever. Let them, Halvard said, and there was something reckless in it. It's raw material now. Let them pipe it. No. She set the notice down. Think, Grandpa. If they get the easement, they control it. They can pipe it where they like, line it, divert it, sell it, cut it off. The day this brick business is worth something is the day they realize they own the mud it's made of. He hadn't thought of that. He'd been so busy treating the sludge as a nuisance to survive that he'd never considered it as a thing that could be owned. And the moment Wren said it, the shape of the real threat came clear, and it was worse than a falling shed. A falling shed you could rebuild. If Kellen secured that easement and then noticed what he was doing with their waste, they could either shut off the supply he now depended on, or worse, decide the process was theirs to license, and where would a broke old pig farmer stand against a plant's lawyers? How long do we have? He asked. Wren checked the notice. The objection window closes in 3 weeks. If nobody files against the easement by then, it goes through automatic. 3 weeks. And filing an objection meant exactly the thing he'd refused to do at the very start. Standing in the county office, in front of clerks and neighbors, and making his private trouble a matter of public record. Worse than before, now, because now he'd have to explain what the sludge was worth to him, which meant explaining the bricks, which meant the whole valley knowing what he'd been up to and judging whether it was clever or foolish. He put it off. That was the flaw in motion, and the story did not let him off for it. He put it off for 4 days, telling himself he was too busy, and in those 4 days 2 things went wrong that were his own fault. The first, pushing to build a boundary wall along the flooded corner, to keep the next overflow off the yard, he mixed a batch too wet and too fast, impatient, skipping the slow preheat because he wanted the wall up before he'd let himself go to the county. The bricks from that rushed firing came out underbaked in the core, and he laid them anyway, telling himself they'd cure in place. They did not. The first hard rain 10 days later would find them. The second was worse, and it cost him Wren, for a while. Piet Ostergaard, rebuffed at the fence, had gone quiet, but his younger cousin, who worked at the plant, had not. Word had reached Kellen that the old Bissett place was doing something with the red slurry, and a man from the plant's office drove out, pleasant and sharp, and stood in the yard admiring the new shed, and asked Halvard, casually, smiling, whether he'd be interested in a small consulting arrangement. The plant, the man said, had been looking for a way to reduce its waste disposal costs. If Halvard would just share his method, the mix, the firing, the numbers, the plant would pay him a flat fee, quite generous, and take it from there. A flat fee. Money, now in his hand, enough to cover the autumn tax with room to spare. All he had to do was hand over the notebook. And Halvard, tired, behind on the wall, 3 weeks from a legal deadline he dreaded, 71 years old with a bad wrist, was tempted. He did not say no on the spot. He said he'd think on it, and when Wren came out and learned that the man was from Kellen and that her grandfather had said he'd think on it, she understood before he did what he'd almost agreed to. That's the notebook, she said. That's everything. Every number, every failure, every fix. You'd hand it to the people who flooded us for 1 tax payment, and then they'd own it, and we'd have nothing, and every farmer in this valley who could have made their own bricks would be buying them back from the plant. It's money we need now. It's the farm, she said, and you were about to sell it to feel safe. She went to her mother's for a week. Not far. Lise had a few days between contracts and was staying in the city, but she went, and she took the argument with her, and the farmhouse was very quiet without her. Halvard did not call the plant man back, but he didn't call the county either. He sat in the stalled middle of it, which was the worst place his flaw could put him, alone, behind, and certain that moving in any direction meant asking someone for something. He worked the farm because the pigs didn't care about easements. He fed the runt, now a fat and thriving weaner. He looked at the notebook every night, and did not open it, and did not hand it over. The rushed boundary wall failed on the 6th day of Wren's absence. It rained hard overnight, the first real rain since he'd laid it, and in the morning the middle third of the wall had slumped and buckled where the underbaked bricks had drunk the water and gone soft, exactly as Batch 5 had, exactly as she'd warned. The wall he'd built to hold back the flood had dissolved in the flood, and because it had failed, the overflow that night had come through unchecked and pooled again in the low yard, red and rising, threatening the new shed's founding. He stood looking at the ruined wall in the rain, and the humiliation of it was total and entirely private, which was the only kind he'd ever allowed himself. There was no one to see. That was the point of how he'd built his life. And standing there soaked, he understood for the first time that the emptiness of having no one to see his failure was the same emptiness as having no one to share his success, and that he had chosen it, brick by brick, for years. He almost called the plant man then. Take the money, give them the numbers, let it be their problem. He got as far as the phone. What stopped him was the notebook, open on the table where he'd left it, in Wren's small, square handwriting. He read a page he'd never really read before, not the numbers, but the note she'd written in the margin beside Batch 5, the rain failure, the one whose lesson he'd just ignored and paid for. A brick that skips the slow cure looks the same as a good one for exactly 10 days. Don't trust the ones you rushed. He'd rushed them, she'd told him, in writing weeks ago, and he'd been too impatient and too proud to obey his own record. The method wasn't in his hands. It never had been. It was in the notebook, in the two of them, in the sharing of it, and the plant man wanted to buy the notebook precisely because the notebook was the thing that made it repeatable, teachable, real. To sell it was to prove Wren's whole argument for her, that a thing only one person guards dies with that person, and a thing written down and shared outlives them all. He put the phone down. Then the letter came from the county, the automatic reminder, timed to the calendar, that the easement objection window would close in 9 days, and that after that date, the drainage arrangement across his land would be permanent and beyond appeal. 9 days, Wren gone, the wall down, the yard flooding again, the plant circling his method with an open checkbook and a lawyer's easement, and Halvard alone in the farmhouse with a notebook he finally understood, and no idea how to do the one thing it required of him, which was to stop being alone. He had one card, and it was the hardest card in his hand to play. He would have to ask. He drove to the Ostergaard place the next morning. It was the longest short drive of his life, a mile of road he'd avoided taking for decades, and he sat in the truck in their yard for a full minute before he made himself get out. Piet came to the door wary. 50 years of silence stood between the two men on the step. "I built a wall wrong," Halvard said. No preamble. He didn't have the equipment for preamble. Rushed the bricks. It fell down. "You were right that they'll work, and I was too proud to sell you any, and now I'm here to ask you for the thing you offered me, which I turned down like a fool. The post drill. Your boy for the heavy days. And more than that." Piet said nothing, so Halvard made himself keep going, which was the hardest labor of the whole ordeal. The plant's filing to make the runoff permanent. 9 days to object or it's law forever. They came to me offering to buy the brick method outright. The whole thing, the numbers, everything. Because they've worked out the mud's worth something now. If they get that easement and that method, they own the both of it, and every farm in this valley that could have dug itself out the way I have will be buying bricks back from the people who flooded them. He took a breath. I can't fight the easement alone. One old man objecting looks like a grudge. But every bordering farm objecting together, that's a case. And I can't teach the brick to a whole valley alone either. But I've got a notebook that says exactly how, written so anyone can follow it, and a granddaughter who wrote it, and if a few of us learn it before the plant does, they can't own it. You can't patent a thing the whole county already knows how to make. It was the longest speech of Halvard's life, and it was, underneath, a surrender, of pride, of solitude, of the whole armored way he'd lived since Marta died. He was asking for help, and offering it in the same breath, which he was old enough to finally understand were the same act. Piet looked at him a long moment. My father, Piet said slowly, always said your father was the stubbornest man in the valley. A pause. Guess it bred true. But something in his face had eased. Show me the wall that fell down. If I'm going to stand up at the county and swear your bricks are worth protecting, I want to see the ones that failed, and I want to hear why. That, the willingness to be shown the failure, not just the success, was the thing Halvard hadn't known he needed. He'd have hidden the fallen wall from anyone. Instead, he drove Piet back to it, and stood in the flood-marked yard and explained, without softening it, exactly what he'd done wrong. The rushed cure, the underbaked cores, the margin note from his own granddaughter that he'd ignored. He explained it the way Wren had taught him to explain things, every failure, exactly, so it could be avoided by whoever came next. And in explaining the failure honestly to another man, he crossed the line he'd been unable to cross the entire story. He stopped guarding the method. He started teaching it. Piet crouched by the fallen wall, turned an underbaked brick in his hands, and understood it completely from the telling. Slow cure, Piet said. Don't trust the rushed ones for 10 days. That's it, said Halvard. That's the whole of it. Then let's go get the others, Piet said, standing. 9 days isn't much time to raise a valley. They had 8 days when it all came apart. Halvard called Wren that night to tell her, to say she'd been right, that he'd gone to Piet, that he was ready to do it her way, all of it. He wanted her back for the fight. The notebook was hers. The words were hers. And he'd finally understood that. He got Lise instead, his own daughter, and the news she gave him took the ground out from under the whole thing. Wren wasn't coming back for the fight. Wren had gotten a call from the college. A spot had opened in an early cohort with a stipend attached, real money, the kind that changed a life. But she had to be enrolled and on campus in 6 days to take it. Lise had already helped her accept. Wren was leaving for the city at week's end. She'd wanted to call him herself, and hadn't been able to face it, because she knew what her going now, right in the teeth of the deadline, would do to him. Halvard sat in the dark kitchen with the phone in his hand, after Lise rang off. 6 days to raise a valley, fight a plant, and object to an easement, and the one person who could hold the words together, who'd written the notebook, who was the whole plan's spine the way the straw was the bricks, was leaving in 5. He'd finally learned to ask for help on the exact night the help he most needed walked out the door toward the future he himself had paid the deposit to send her to. He could not ask her to stay. It would cost her everything, and without her, he did not believe he could do it. He didn't sleep. He sat with the notebook open in front of him, page after page of Wren's small square hand, and read it all the way through for the first time, Not the numbers he already knew, but the whole shape of it, start to finish, the record of two people learning a thing together through failure after failure. And somewhere near the end, in the reading, the false belief he'd carried his whole life finally cracked all the way through, the way Batch 1 had cracked, corner to corner. He'd thought the terrible thing was needing people. He'd built everything. After Marta, after the casseroles, after every soft-eyed offer of help he'd refused, on the conviction that to need someone was to be weak, and to be seen needing them was to be pitied, and pity was the one thing he could not survive. So he'd made himself an island and called it strength. But the notebook in his hands was the opposite of an island. It was the proof that the best thing he'd made in 30 years he had not made alone. Every good brick in that new shed had a girl's chemistry in it and an old man's hands, and neither alone would have raised a single course. The method wasn't his, it was theirs. And the whole point of it, the thing Wren had been saying since the first cracked batch, was that a thing only one person can do dies with that person, and a thing shared outlives them all. He'd been about to sell that truth to the plant to feel safe. He'd nearly kept it locked in his own guarded hands until it died there with him. And now the girl who'd taught it to him was leaving, and his instinct, his old, deep, wrong instinct, was to see that as abandonment, as one more person leaving him alone with the load. But that was the island talking, because the notebook meant she didn't have to stay. That was the entire genius of writing it down. She had already given him everything the fight needed. It was on the pages, in a hand any farmer in the valley could read. He didn't need Wren's presence. He needed to do the thing she'd been begging him to do all summer, the thing he'd refused. Put it in other people's hands. Trust it to outlive its makers. Let her go and carry the work forward without her, because she'd built it, on purpose, to be carried without her. She wasn't leaving him alone. She'd spent all summer making sure he'd never have to be. He closed the notebook. He knew, now, what to build. He made 2 calls before dawn. The first was to Piet Ostergaard. "Change of plan," Halvard said. "Bigger. We don't just object to the easement quiet, and we don't just make bricks for the 2 of us. We teach it, openly. Every farm on the runoff, and any that'll come, this week, before the window closes. If a dozen families know how to make these bricks and can stand up at the county and say so, the plant can't buy a method that's already common knowledge, and they can't run their mud across a valley that's on record needing it and using it. We turn the whole thing public, the one thing I swore I'd never do." Piet, on the other end, was quiet a moment. "That's Wren's idea." "It's always been Wren's idea. I'm just finally saying it out loud." The second call was to Wren herself. He didn't ask her to stay. He asked her for 1 day, before she left. Not to work the kiln, to stand up in front of the valley and teach the thing she'd written, so that everyone would know whose it was. She came on the 4th morning, with 2 days left before the objection window closed and 1 before her own train to the city. She came with her mother's car and a bag already packed for the college in the back seat, which Halvard made himself look at and not flinch from. She was going. That was right. Today was not about keeping her. They held it in the Bisset yard, because the yard had the new shed to point at, and the kiln to demonstrate, and the flood-scarred corner to stand accusingly beside. Piet had done the gathering, a man from a family that hadn't spoken to a Bisset in 50 years, walking the valley for 3 days telling farmers to come see what old Halvard had done with the plant's mud. And they came. Not a crowd. This was a thin populated valley of tired farms. But 11 households sent someone, which in that valley was nearly everyone the runoff touched, and they stood in a loose half-circle in the yard with the wariness of people who'd been disappointed before, and had driven over mostly to see an old man's folly up close. Halvard stood in front of them and did the second hardest thing he'd ever done, which was to speak to a group of his neighbors and ask them, plainly, for something. "You all know what's been coming off that plant onto our low ground," he said. "You all know what it's done to your ditches and your sills, same as mine, and you'll have seen the notice, that they mean to make it permanent, this week, unless enough of us stand up and say no." He paused, gathering. "I'm not here to ask you to fight for me. I'm here to give you a reason the fight's worth your time. Because that mud isn't only ruin. My granddaughter worked out its building material, and she's going to show you exactly how, right now, holding nothing back, because the more of us that can make it, the less the plant can ever own it." And then he stepped back, and he gave the yard to Wren. This was the sacrifice and the proof of change in one motion. The man who'd refused to sell a single brick for fear of being seen wrong, now standing aside to let the whole valley watch the method demonstrated, failures and all, by a 19-year-old with a notebook. If it went wrong in front of everyone. He had spent his whole life avoiding exactly this. He stood back and let it happen. Wren was nervous, and then she wasn't, because she knew the material the way he knew a farrowing. She had the notebook, but she barely opened it. She walked them through it, standing over the mixing board with a spade in her hand. "The clay alone cracks," she said, and she showed them a batch 1 reject, the corner-to-corner split. "It's all fine particles, no frame, so you give it a frame." She turned the manure heap with the spade. Fiber, chopped straw, or the fibrous stuff out of a well-rotted manure pile. You've all got that. And you cut the stickiness with grit so it doesn't slump. She lifted a handful of gray furnace ash. Wood ash, coal ash, whatever your stove throws off. You've all got that too. She said the proportions plain, the ones from the notebook, 5 and 1.5 and 2 handfuls, and she said them twice so they'd stick. And then she said the thing that mattered more than the numbers. "But the proportions are a starting place, not a rule. Your clay's not exactly ours. You'll mix a test batch, you'll let it crack or crumble or hold, and you'll adjust from there. Write down what you do. That's the whole secret. Not the mix, the writing down." Halvard watched the faces change. He'd seen it in Piet's face at the fence, and now he saw it move through 11 households at once. The moment where scorn tips into calculation, where a farmer stops seeing a fool and starts seeing a floor he could pave, a sill he could replace, a wall he could raise, out of the very mud that had been ruining him, for the cost of his own labor and the ash he'd been throwing away. A woman near the front, Halvard knew her, Brenna Voss, whose dairy sat at the very bottom of the runoff and had suffered worst, spoke up. "How do you cook them? You don't have a kiln." "We built one out of nothing," Wren said. "Come see." She took them behind the feed store to the clamp kiln, and Halvard took over there, because the firing was the part that lived in his hands. He showed them the stack, the fuel channels, the base of failed bricks, the clay slurry skin. He told them, without softening any of it, about the first firing that collapsed. Too much fuel, too fast, low down. He told them about the rushed wall that fell in the rain 6 days ago because he'd skipped the slow cure, and he said the margin note aloud from memory. Don't trust the rushed ones for 10 days. He gave them his failures as freely as his successes, because he understood now that the failures were the more valuable gift. Anyone could copy a success and be ruined by the first hard rain, but a man who knew why the wall fell could build one that stood. 11 households, standing around a kiln built out of a ruined shed, watching an old man teach them the exact shape of his mistakes. It was, Halvard thought, the least alone he had been in 30 years. Then a truck turned in off the county road, and the man from Kellen Ceramics got out with a briefcase, and the finale's real trouble arrived. The plant man was pleasant, as he'd been before, and he was not stupid. He'd heard about the gathering. In a valley that thin, everything was heard, and he'd come to do the one thing that could still kill it. He walked into the yard smiling, set his briefcase on the tailgate of Halvard's truck, and addressed not Halvard, but the whole gathered half-circle, which told Halvard at once that the man understood exactly where the danger was. "Folks, glad to see so many neighbors here." He was smooth. "I represent Kellen Ceramics, and I want to clear up a misunderstanding, because I think Mr. Bissett here means well, but he's got you chasing something that'll cost you. That drainage easement everyone's worried about. The plant is prepared to make it worth your while. We'll pay a yearly sum to every bordering parcel for the drainage right. Real money, every year, into farms I know are hurting, and—" he opened the briefcase. "For anyone interested in these bricks, the plant is developing a proper product line, kiln-fired to standard, certified, warrantied. You won't have to burn manure in your yards and hope. You'll buy them from us, cheap, made right. So why do it the hard way when you can do it the easy way and get paid for the privilege?" It was, Halvard saw, a very good offer, and it was aimed precisely at the tired, broke, doubtful part of every person in that yard, the part that had driven over expecting folly and would be glad of a reason to go home. Money now, for the easement. Bricks later, guaranteed, someone else's problem to fire. All they had to do was not object this week and let the plant own the mud and the method both. Halvard felt the yard tilt toward the man. He saw Brenna Voss, who needed money worst of anyone, go still and thoughtful. He saw the calculation running the other way now. And this was the final complication, and it was aimed at the exact center of who Halvard had been. The easy road, the road where you take the money and let a stronger party carry the load and own the outcome. His whole flawed life had been, in a sense, a version of this same bargain. Take the safe thing, avoid the risk of standing up in front of people and being wrong. If old Halvard had been standing here, he'd have had no answer, because old Halvard's only move was to retreat into his own yard and refuse to sell a brick and let the plant win by default. But he wasn't that man anymore, and the thing that proved it was what he did next. He did not argue with the man about money. He couldn't win on money. The plant had more of it. Instead, he did the thing he'd learned all summer, the thing the whole story had been teaching him. He told the truth about a failure, and he trusted the people in front of him to understand it. "He's right that it's real money," Halvard said to the yard, stepping forward. "And I won't stand here and tell you your farms don't need it. Mine does. 2 weeks ago, a man from that plant offered me a fat check for this method, and I near took it, because I needed the tax money, and I was tired and proud, and I wanted to be done. So I understand the pull. I do." The yard was quiet. But here's the arithmetic he's not saying out loud. Halvard picked up a good brick from the stack, and beside it, an underbaked one from the fallen wall. You take his yearly money for the easement, and you've sold him the right to run that mud across your land forever. And you buy his certified bricks instead of making your own, and now the mud that floods your ditches isn't your raw material, it's his product. He owns the flood and he owns the fix, and you pay him for both, every year, forever. Or, he held up the good brick, you object this week, all of us together, and you learn to make these yourselves, out of the mud that's already ruining you, for the cost of your own ash and labor. And nobody owns it, because the whole valley knows how. He can't sell you a secret you already have. He set both bricks down. He wants to buy the method, so it stays a secret only he controls. My granddaughter wrote it down all summer, so it could never be a secret again. That's the whole fight, right there on the tailgate. His briefcase, or her notebook, rented from the people who flooded you, or owned by the people it flooded. The plant man opened his mouth, and Wren spoke first, clear, unhurried, holding the notebook up so they could see it. "It's all in here," she said. "Every number, every mistake, written so anyone can follow it. Copies for whoever wants one. Free." She looked at the plant man, almost kind. "You can't put that back in the box." It was Brenna Voss who moved first. She'd suffered worst. She had the most to gain from easy money, and she was the one who stepped forward and put her name to the objection sheet Piet had pinned to the shed door. "My grandmother made cob," she said. "I'll not rent my own dirt back from anybody." And once one name went down, the rest followed, the way a fired stack holds once the first course sets, until 9 households had signed, and the plant man's yearly money was so much paper. He closed his briefcase quietly and drove away, and no one watched him go, because they were all crowded around Wren, asking about proportions. A year later, at first light, Halvard stood at the same gate. The low corner of the yard was dry. Where the red lake had been, a thick brick wall ran along the property line. Properly cured, slow-fired, hard as the day it left the kiln, and behind it, the drainage ran clean in a lined channel the valley had cut together. The plant's overflow diverted and, by the objection 9 households had signed, kept to its permitted bounds. The near shed stood warm and square in its red brick, and beyond it, on the Ostergaard side of the fence, Halvard could see the raw stack of Piet's own bricks curing in his own yard. He was not alone at the gate. Brenna Voss was coming up the lane for the week's firing. 3 valley farms shared the big kiln now, and Halvard taught the burn to whoever came, holding nothing back, giving away every failure he'd ever made. In his coat pocket was a letter, read so many times it had gone soft. Wren, from the college, top of the early cohort. She'd sent a diagram of an improved kiln for him to try, and a line at the bottom. "Write down what happens, so I can do it after you." He gripped the top rail. The old ache traveled up his wrist. He held the line, and he was not holding it alone.